First of all, and I'll see if there's a way for me to track questions as we go along. I would One of the upsides and downsides to the pandemic, there are many downsides. One of the upsides is that these sorts of things can potentially be more interactive, but that may require you asking questions in a way, in a persistent way that I see them. Because when I look at the screen, I see myself, I see my slides, and I see a Q&A place. I am very happy to take questions. If we were in person, I would stress this over and over. Very happy to take questions as we go along because I want this to be of use to you. I'm not interested in giving an infomercial either for my employer or for myself. I'd really like it to be helpful to you as we, and actually to me as well as we discuss this. But as we go, I want to talk again about open source in the cloud and the opportunity for cloud to be a force multiplier for open source. I wrote a series recently for the News Stack talking about different open source builders or maintainers of different open source projects. One thing that I found super interesting in talking with these maintainers is the reason that they were involved, almost to a person. Actually, every single maintainer that I talked to was super focused on the fun element of open source. They were looking for ways to make open source more fun, and also we're trying to figure out ways to make it more sustainable. I think cloud gives us an opportunity to make open source both more sustainable and frankly more fun. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. If you think of the biggest open source contributors to open, and name your companies. When I was at Adobe, I ran developer relations at Adobe for a few years, and while I was there, we can't that you could still find out on GitHub that enabled us to count contributions to open source projects. And we did it internally because we wanted to benchmark how we were doing as a company. In the process of doing that, we also were able to see what other companies were doing. So it became a useful tool to kind of benchmark us against our peers in the industry and hopefully to change internal behaviors. And we found that it did do that. One thing that I found in the process of doing that is that if you were to look at the top 5 contributors to open source, and when I say top 5 contributors, we're measuring that in terms of number of contributors, active contributors within a company. 4 of the top 5 are cloud companies. If you widen that aperture just a little bit and look at the top 10 companies, top 10 contributors, corporate contributors to open source, 7 of the top 10 are cloud companies. There's been this myth in the industry for the last few years that cloud is somehow in conflict with open source, that it eats open source or in some way destroys open source. But when you look at who the contributors are, it kind of belies that notion or contradicts that notion. And I'd like to spend some time talking through why that is, why cloud is actually a natural complement to open source. You couldn't have any of the cloud vendors, let me step back. I don't want to say vendors. If you couldn't have any of the cloud companies without open source, because you can't have the cloud without open source. And partly that's an economic statement. If you think of the thousands, tens of thousands, potentially millions of servers that are running, and you tried to, I don't know, if you tried to do that with Microsoft Windows, great operating system, but you tried to do that with Windows, unless you were Microsoft running it, you just couldn't do it. Or if you tried to run build it using a commercial database, again, wrong word, proprietary database, you couldn't do it. And it's not because it's bad technology, it's just because the economics don't work. But even beyond the economics of of trying to build a hyperscale cloud service out of proprietary components. Just the mechanics of counting licenses would quickly become too cumbersome to be able to do that. And it was actually Erica Brescia of GitHub who first made that point to me. So without the cloud, or without open source, you don't have the cloud. But as we kind of get into with the statistic that I gave before about the number of cloud companies that are active contributors to open source, you also don't have open source in the way that we have it today without those cloud companies. The one way to think about this is comes back to who are the biggest users of open source. And the answer to that is cloud companies, and I'm not exclusively referring or even intentionally limiting it here to companies like Microsoft with Azure or AWS or Google Cloud. I'm talking in general about cloud companies. And as I'm going to go into more detail, I'm talking about companies like Lyft, companies like Capital One, companies that have made a strategic bet on the cloud and open source. And it turns out that as these cloud companies use more open source, we're also contributing more open source. And I think that that's a key thing. A colleague of mine at AWS, Matt Wilson, made this statement, and I really should pull it out so that I can quote him verbatim rather than kind of adding color to it as I go. But Matt said, if you look at the history of software, of enterprise software, it's pretty bad. And I think whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, no matter your party, we might disagree on lots of things. We're probably not going to disagree on that. No one's going to fact check what I just said there about enterprise software being, in general, pretty crappy. And so it's something that we can all agree on. And the reason that Matt gave for that was that that the vendors aren't using the software. They're building it and selling it to somebody else rather than actually using it. One of the benefits of the cloud is, and one of the things that we've seen over the last few years with open source, think, for example, of Kubernetes. Super popular project for good reasons. Great open source project, and maybe even an even better open source community around it. Well, where was Kubernetes born? It was born from Google's use of that software, or equivalent software, in their case, their internal software called the Borg. Think of the other great open source projects that we increasingly use. They were born out of use. What was it? Hadoop, born out of Yahoo's use, Doug Cutting, the work that he did there. There's all sorts of examples of this. I'm going to talk about a few, but I keep talking about it through the lens of companies. And I want to take a second and talk about open source and the cloud through the lens of the individuals. And this, I think, might be my only non-Pi related picture, but I like to ski, and it's almost ski season here in Utah. So indulge me for a second. But I want to talk about people. I want to tell some stories. The first story is of Dries Buytaert of Drupal fame. Now, Drupal today is this massively popular project with, in the last release, their last major release, Dries told me that they had 10,000 individual contributors, which is kind of shocking and amazing. And it becomes even more so when I said, well, what about your company, Dries? So he co-founded a company called Acquia. I said, well, surely Acquia is a big contributor to Drupal. And he said, well, we're a significant contributor, but we account for less than 5% of contributions to the last release. So here's this massively popular project, lots of community around it. It didn't start that way. It started with Dries and a few friends at his university in Belgium years and years ago, 20 plus years ago, just trying to figure out how to share an ADSL connection. So Dries built this little bulletin board or message service so that they could talk about who had access to the ADSL connection and when. Fast forward a few years, and Dries is trying to scale that. He says in 2000, he started trying to scale it with MySQL and really struggled because MySQL, while a fantastic database, for him, he said there were hundreds of knobs and dials that he had to tweak in order to scale Drupal. And it was a real struggle for them. Fast forward to 2006 and AWS launches. He said, and these are his words, not mine. He says, you have no idea how much easier it became for us to scale MySQL and hence to scale the open source project Drupal. So that's one example of the benefits to an open source developer like Dries to building with the cloud and how the cloud enabled that open source project to grow. But there are others, and this is one that I really love because in 2009, Jim Whitehurst, then the CEO of Red Hat, now the president of IBM, had this comment where he talked about how what a struggle, what an immense amount of waste there was in enterprise IT, because all these companies with roughly the same needs were reinventing the wheel, either buying from vendors who weren't delivering what they wanted, or building similar projects, internal projects over and over and over and not sharing. Well, in 2015, Matt Klein, who his pedigree includes AWS, Twitter, he did amazing work at Twitter, super engineer. He was at Lyft, the ride-sharing company, and trying to figure out how to help move the company from a monolithic-based architecture to microservices-based. And in the process, he built Envoy. We think of Envoy today as this popular CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation project that companies use for a service mesh that has all sorts of contributions from dozens and dozens of contributions from a range of people, including Google, who I think Chris DeBona told me a week or so ago that Google contributes something like 40% of the code to Envoy. Great success story. But back in the day, it wasn't. It was Matt building this for Lyft to solve their immediate needs. And he then had to figure out, well, should we open source this? He said, I didn't really have any experience with open source, but I wanted to do it because he thought it would be good for his career, and Lyft thought it might be good for their recruiting, to be kind of looked at as a visionary or a strong engineering culture. And so they did it. And he said it nearly killed him that next year of work doing the marketing and other, frankly, non-technical work to make Envoy a success. But they did it. And again, today you have cloud companies that are contributing to it, and Lyft, which I would describe as a cloud company or a cloud and open source oriented company, building for the cloud, building for this cloud native future, contributing that. And again, another example of an individual not working for a cloud vendor per se, but working for within the construct of the cloud and contributing that code. It's an example that I hope we'll see a lot more of, because I love the idea of that user-driven or end-user-driven open source software. Because again, coming back to Matt Wilson's point, there's a lot of Matts in this presentation. I apologize for that. It wasn't intentional. But coming back to user-driven innovation in open source. So that's the second example. The third is almost Matt, Madeline Olson. But her story really starts with Salvatore Sanfilippo, who was the founder of Redis. When Salvatore started Redis, he started it because he couldn't figure out a way to scale MySQL cost effectively. Again, great database, but it just didn't work for him. So he did what everyone would do in that situation, he went off and built his own database, and he had no experience with that. He wasn't a database expert by any stretch, but he just decided he wanted to do it. And years later, Madeline and her boss at AWS, she works on the Elasticache team that offers a managed Redis service. She decided she wanted to contribute. And one of the things that she felt like Redis needed was built-in encryption, TLS encryption. So she submitted a pull request for that. Well, Salvatore didn't take it. He was worried that adding encryption, building an encryption would make Redis kind of inelegant or would complicate things. But he liked the way that Madeline approached it. So while he didn't accept her code, he did accept the approach that she proposed, and he and Yossi Gottlieb, one of the other contributors to Redis, implemented it. And that put Madeline on his radar. And Madeline spent the next 2-ish years figuring out ways to make contribution to Redis easier. As she would describe it, little contributions that she made, but they added up to other people being able to make more significant contributions. When I asked her, well, why are you doing this? What's in it for AWS? And she said, well, it might be the case that people will use Redis and decide to, and maybe they'll struggle and they'll decide to use Elasticache as a managed service, or maybe they won't. But either way, we need more people to use Redis. And so if we can make Redis through our customer feedback, we know what our customers want. If we can make Redis that much better, it makes it that much more likely that our customers will be able to use it. And if it makes the Redis community and the Redis pie bigger for everyone, great. The thing that I love most about this story, in addition to Madeline, who I think is fantastic, is what it did to Redis Labs, the company that grew up after Salvatore started Redis. Redis Labs was formed to help fund additional development to Redis and to employ Salvatore and give him freedom to be able to just focus on the code. But Redis Labs did more than that. In the wake of Salvatore deciding that he just wanted to move on from Redis, from his baby, and go work on other things, Redis Labs decided to broaden the governance for the Redis project. And that's when Madeline became one of the 5 maintainers of it. In the process, they did something even more significant. They've opened up governance. They've opened it up so that other companies can also build managed Redis services. And there are a number of them, and I'm probably forgetting a few on here. Everyone from AWS and Microsoft and Google to Ivan and DigitalOcean, Instacluster. When I talked with the Ivan chief product officer last week, he said they're doing phenomenally well. I know from talking with Redis Labs that they're a great partner of AWS. They're doing really well. And this particular example strikes me as the right way to do open source, where instead of focusing and fixating on micromanaging that bottom of the funnel to try to compete for a relatively small pie, Redis Labs is figuring out how to grow adoption of Redis and development to Redis. And then they have a bigger pie to share from. And I know they're doing really well financially. So it's a super positive example, and it gives me, it kind of leads into this other idea. I'm going to use Airbnb for a second. They're an AWS customer, but the reason that they're interesting is the different ways that they exhibit contributions to Redis. And this is just an example that's close to home, so I can speak to it authoritatively. They started off running self-managed Redis on EC2, and they struggled, frankly. They have I think of Airbnb as a relatively big company, but in this case, this is a super small team with as it says down in the quote, 2 full-time engineers. So they needed an easier way to manage Redis. Well, they turned to Elasticache and found that, and found a much easier way to manage their Redis deployment. Now, the interesting thing for me here is behind the scenes, what do we have? We have Madeline Olson and other engineers contributing things like client-side caching, TLS encryption. And remember, I said that the actual code wasn't accepted, but the approach was contributing operational support for the customer and contributing marketing of Redis. So at least 3 different ways that we were contributing here. Meanwhile, other companies like Redis Labs, like Microsoft, like Google, like Ivan, have also been contributing in their ways with probably similar customer success stories. This is how I think open source should work. It's about more pie, more sharing, not less. So let's talk about pie for a second. And you say, well, Matt, you've already been talking about pie. Let's talk more about more pie. Gartner, even in the cluster that 2020 is, global IT spending is expected to top is almost 4 trillion this year. And as much as we talk about cloud and we talk about how big it is, and it is, and it's significant, global cloud spending will be roughly 266 billion. Big number, but compared to that 4 trillion, not that big. And while I was an English major, and so my math should never be trusted, I've done this math a few times and no one's yet challenged me on it, that I think this means that when we start talking about cloud and we start talking about how competitive it is with open source and with traditional IT, we're still talking about 6% of the market. We're still talking about a little tiny corner of overall IT spending. And frankly, we're still talking about a little corner of open source. It's getting bigger, but it's still relatively small. Part of this is we've become used to deflationary thinking, and not just with cloud. We think of cloud as, I think the wrong way to think about cloud is that it's a cost savings. Yes, you can save money with cloud, but I don't think that's the primary driver. The primary driver is opening up opportunities. And it's the same thing with open source. Martin Mikos, good friend, 15-ish years ago when he was the CEO of MySQL, he's now the CEO of HackerOne, and I believe will be keynoting tomorrow. He had this, and Martin is fantastic at coming up with quotes like this. Talked about taking an existing market, shrinking that market, and then taking a big chunk of that market. And so I dubbed this Mikosian economics, even though this is mostly just an exercise in Martin coming up with a really clever quotes that get him quoted all over. But when we think about this, we think about open source and cloud as something that equals less pie for everyone. It's, like I said, deflationary. In a separate conversation with Simon Wardley, who's graced these All Things Open halls before, he introduced me to something called Jevons paradox. And it basically goes like this. We tend to think that when unit costs go down, like for example, the cost of my phone goes down, I'll pocket those savings and spend less money. And I can tell you from my home economics course that I live every day here in my house, it doesn't work that way. When we save money, let's say we save money by moving to a cloud vendor for our compute needs, or when we save money by buying into a lower cost database, let's say we use Postgres instead of Oracle or something. We like to think that the IT department is going to pocket those savings and then send that money back to headquarters. Thank you very much. It doesn't work that way. What those lower unit costs end up doing is unlocking potential to spend more money. And that's what we've seen. For example, when I was at MongoDB, where I ran marketing and community for a time, MongoDB, yes, it was a lower cost option to Oracle for kind of a general purpose database. But that's not what we saw, is that people would then like use MongoDB and save money. They did save money, but they also then spent more money on building all sorts of new applications that they couldn't before. And both open source and cloud end up doing that. They end up enabling all sorts of new things that people can do. So cloud and open source together are not deflationary at all. They end up increasing the size of the market and increasing opportunities for all done right. So it's about growing the open source pie, not just one pie, but think of each open source community as a pie in and of itself. And I had this conversation with a former current friend and former colleague that I worked with at MongoDB at AWS reInvent maybe a year ago. And we were talking about, but this was back in the days when you got on planes and you went to Vegas and you complained about being in Vegas. Now we're all pining to go to Vegas, sadly. But we were talking about how we competed. So we have DocumentDB and they had and he has MongoDB, and we talked about how those two databases compete. And it occurred to us in that conversation that we were focused on the wrong thing. We were focused on, if you're in sales, you think of top of the funnel, that's like your universe of opportunities, and bottom of the funnel is closed sales. We were thinking about the bottom of the funnel when the more interesting and important thing in the conversation was the top of the funnel. So we started talking about, well, how can we increase the size of the pie for everyone? How can we increase the number of enterprises out there that want to use a document style database, that become fluent with JSON, et cetera? And that's where we went. And that became the focus for me at AWS, was working with erstwhile competitors who actually were also partners, companies like Confluent and Redis Labs and MongoDB and DataStax and HashiCorp. All of these companies that you could say, well, you compete with them. And they say, yes, there's one small service at AWS that competes with them, and the entire rest of the company is set up to help them succeed and thrive. And so that became my focus, was how do I get these open source communities to grow? How do we make Redis bigger? How do we make Kafka bigger for Confluent, for us, for Ivan, for Instacluster, for everyone? Because it's so much more interesting to grow things than to divvy up some zero-sum game. I don't like small amounts of pie. I like more. So some open source truths. We all benefit more than we contribute. Every single person on the planet, this is true. We're all net consumers of open source. Not everyone can contribute code. So celebrate users of your code, because users can also be really useful to you. Operations matters a lot, and making open source code easier for people to use increases that size of the pie. And Salvatore told me another interesting thing. Most people can't afford to contribute unless it's directly aligned to their business. So assume that a lot of the people in your community will just be net users and won't be able to contribute. And that's okay. And finally, no contribution is too small. Chris Naroth of the Apache Software Foundation said this to me recently, that there's all sorts of needs within any open source project, and we should celebrate even small contributions, because those small contributions can end up growing in size as that contributor contributes in larger and larger ways. And so I'm going to end here. Let's figure out how to make pie bigger. Let's stop fixating on how cloud competes with open source and start thinking more about how we can use cloud to enable more pie, more market, more community for everyone. I think that as we do that, we'll find there's a lot of pie for us all. Thanks for your time.